Dust danced in the golden light of the setting sun as Silas stood at the edge of his ranch, the weight of solitude heavy on his broad shoulders. The gentle hum of crickets filled the air, broken only by the distant lowing of cattle. His eyes fell upon the girl, Elowen, her silhouette framed against the weathered barn. She moved with a grace that belied her silence, each step a whisper of resilience. Elowen's gaze met his, a world of unspoken stories swirling in her dark eyes. Silence wrapped around them like a familiar blanket, yet a flicker of understanding passed between them, deeper than words. The ranch echoed with the promise of new beginnings, but shadows loomed. The past clung to Elowen like a second skin. As she approached, her lips parted, and the name escaped her mouth, fragile yet powerful. Silas. Just a breath, but it shattered the stillness, igniting a spark of hope. The cold wind whipped through the open fields, a relentless reminder of the unforgiving world surrounding the ramshackle barn. Under the worn timber beams, Elowen stood shivering, her eyes wide but unseeing, as if she were trapped in a dream she couldn't wake from. Enveloped by the scent of hay and damp earth, she could hear the muffled whispers of the crowd outside, eager buyers exchanging murmurs laden with disdain and curiosity. Her heart raced, the weight of betrayal pressing heavily upon her chest. She had trusted him, her brother, believed in their bond. But here she was, a pawn in a game she never wanted to play. The sound of bootsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Silas stood at the threshold, tall and rugged, with a weathered face that told stories of a hard life. He surveyed the scene, his presence demanding attention without uttering a word. Rumors had circulated about the mute girl being offered for sale. Tales of her beauty and the strange silence that surrounded her whispered like a spell on the wind. He had come seeking a companion for his lonely ranch, a creature to ease the ache of solitude. But as he caught sight of Elowen, shrouded in fear and despair, he felt an unfamiliar tug at the edges of his heart. Silas stepped closer, his eyes meeting Elowen's. She flinched, recoiling instinctively as if anticipating another blow. But he did not reach for her. Instead, he regarded her with a mix of curiosity and caution. The bruises on her arms, remnants of a struggle between siblings, painted a stark picture of what had transpired. A chill ran through him, not from the autumn air, but from the realization that someone could strip away another's identity so callously. The silence between them was thick, filled with unsaid words and unexpressed pain. She was frail but beautiful, with hair cascading like dark waterfalls over her shoulders and eyes that reflected a world where sounds had gone mute. Silas felt the breath hitch in his throat as he absorbed the gravity of her situation. Here she was, a girl stolen from her life, and he, an unsuspecting buyer, stood before her as the harbinger of her fate. It gnawed at him, a sense of moral betrayal clawing at his sense of right. But as the crowd outside grew impatient, he felt betrayal tugging him toward decisions he had never wanted to make. Elowen's mind raced, replaying the moment her brother had raised his hand to sell her. The memory scorched her thoughts, an indelible mark of anguish etched deep within her spirit. The moment she had been pushed forward, the stares of strangers weighing down upon her like stones, had shattered whatever belief she had in familial love. She remembered his whispered promises of protection, only for them to dissolve into the air as he bartered her away. She was alone now, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, with no anchor to hold on to. Silas turned slightly, his attention momentarily drawn by the raucous laughter spilling from the crowd. In that fleeting moment, Elowen's gaze shifted to the wooden floor beneath her feet, her heart heavy with the haunting thought that silence could also be a prison. She watched as dust particles danced in the thin shafts of light piercing through the barn, each one a reminder of the way her life had shrunk to this single moment, the moment she could not escape. The weight of her past and an uncertain future loomed larger than the barn's walls themselves. When Silas returned his focus to her, something stirred within him, a fleeting sense of connection that both bewildered and frightened him. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a spark that told him she was still there, buried beneath layers of trauma and despair. An inexplicable bond formed in that space, a silent promise exchanged between two souls caught in the clutches of their own ghosts, but fear twisted in the air, a reminder that intimacy could lead to deeper wounds. Silas swallowed hard, his heart aching as he stood torn between his own loneliness and the girl's silent suffering. He had spent years building walls around his heart, convinced that solitude would shield him from pain, but in front of him stood a flicker of vulnerability, stirring something long dormant. He could not allow himself to feel. Not now. The decision ahead was driven more by obligation than desire, and he couldn't afford to slip into the depths of empathy. As the bidding began outside, tension crackled like a live wire. Eluan's heart raced, each thud echoing in her ears, a desperate beat against the encroaching silence. She stole a glance at Silas, hoping to find an ally in her anguish, but instead met the steely resolve in his eyes, emotional distance that pushed her further into the abyss of despair. She wanted to scream, to break the silence that bound her, to be more than just a commodity. Instead, she hovered in limbo, held captive by unspoken words and the weight of unbroken promises. Eluan stepped off the rickety truck at the edge of the ranch, her palms clammy against the fraying fabric of her dress. The wind whistled a lonely tune through the dusty expanse, stirring up the dry earth and casting her silhouette against the vast empty landscape. The ranch seemed frozen in time, a desolate haven flanked by rugged hills that loomed like silent sentinels, watching over both Eluan and the man who stood a few paces away. Silas, the rancher, remained a shadowy figure, his face obscured by the broad brim of his hat, his hands buried deep in his pockets. A statue carved from the same earth he worked. As she took a tentative step forward, the weight of her silence wrapped around her like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. She hadn't spoken since that day her brother had made the fateful decision to sell her. The memories of the haggling and the quick exchange felt like distant echoes, fading into a realm where her voice was still free. Now, she was a mute girl in a world that seemed to speak a language she did not understand. Eluan's heart thudded in her chest, each beat marking the distance between her and the life she had left behind. Silas shifted slightly, his gaze piercing through the veil of dust that swirled between them. He was a man of few words, his silence a thick blanket that settled over the ranch like the evening mist. Eluan caught a glimpse of his weathered face, weathered yet stoic, framed by the harsh lines of a life spent outdoors. He was not unkind, but the absence of words filled the air, a reminder of the barriers that stood between them. With each passing second, she felt more like a ghost haunting the fringes of his reality. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows that danced around them, and Eluan took a step closer to the wooden porch that creaked beneath her weight. Silas remained still, observing her with a mixture of curiosity and patience. In that moment, Eluan felt the fleeting warmth of a connection, a shared solitude in the vastness of the ranch. She sensed that he too was trapped under the weight of unspoken thoughts, locked away in an unyielding silence, just as she was. When night fell, the world transformed, cloaking the ranch in an inky darkness that seemed to swallow every sound. Eluan found herself curled up on a rough-hewn cot in the small cabin that smelled of cedar and earth. It was modest but held an air of quiet comfort, an invitation to breathe, to rest. As she closed her eyes, she longed for dreams to carry her back to a time when laughter echoed in her ears. Instead, the silence blanketed her, heavy and unyielding, and she struggled to find solace in it. Days faded into one another, a tapestry woven with the threads of routine. Silas's days were long and laborious, hauling bales of hay, mending fences, and tending to the sparse livestock that grazed on the parched land. Eloan had her tasks too, sweeping the porch, gathering kindling, and watching the horizon stretch into infinity. Silently, they moved like two celestial bodies in orbit, drawn together yet forever distant, the gravity of their shared loneliness pulling them closer, though they never spoke. One afternoon, as the sun hung low over the fields, Eloan watched Silas from her perch on the porch, his muscles flexed and strained with every movement as he worked, the sun casting a golden hue upon his skin. It struck her then, the sheer weight of her own silence. She was surrounded by beauty and pain, yet inside her a storm brewed, words that had been stifled, longing to break free, to bridge the chasm between them. But the fear of being voiceless in a world dominated by silence kept her paralyzed. In that fragile stillness, a flutter of hope blossomed within her, a hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find her voice again. Eloan gathered her courage, her heart racing as she pushed herself off the porch, taking slow, deliberate steps toward Silas. She hesitated, a breath caught in her throat, and for the first time since arriving, the desire to be heard surged within her. But before she could call his name, a chill washed over her, a wave of uncertainty that extinguished her resolve. Then something shifted in the air, a delicate tension as Silas met her gaze. In that moment, something unspoken changed between them. He looked at her not as the girl sold by her brother, but as someone deserving of recognition. With a faint flicker of encouragement in his eyes, it was as if he sensed the tumult within her, the flickering embers of her voice that yearned to ignite. Eloan's breath hitched in her throat. She took a step forward, her heart pounding against the confines of her chest, whispering a name she had kept buried deep inside: Silas. Each dawn unfurled like the petals of a shy flower, brushing the landscape with golden hues as the sun spilled over the horizon. Silas woke to the clatter of hooves on the dirt path leading to the barn, the rhythmic sounds and echo of routines carved from years of solitude. Eloan had become a part of this daily dance, and he found himself stealing glances at her as she moved between the livestock, her hands deft and sure. She tended to the animals with grace, an unspoken conversation flowing between her and the creatures, a language he could not decipher but felt in the air, thick with warmth and unexpressed understanding. Days turned into weeks, and as the seasons shifted, so too did the rhythm of their lives. Silas worked the fields, his hands calloused and worn, while Eloan created order in the chaos of the barn and kitchen. Together they formed a fragile tapestry of two lives interwoven in silence, the absence of words, both a comfort and a challenge. Silas admired her determination, her quiet strength, but deep within him stirred an unsettling curiosity. Why did she not speak? What secrets lay behind those deep-set eyes, often cast downward, hiding her thoughts like treasures yet to be unearthed? His evenings were consumed with thoughts of Eloan. He would catch her gaze across the firelight, its flickering shadows playing upon her face, and feel an urge to break the invisible barrier between them. Yet every word he considered felt clumsy, insubstantial against the weight of her silence. Silas longed to know her, not just as the mute girl sold by her brother, but as a person, a soul brimming with unvoiced stories. The air hummed with potential, and he felt a tug in the depths of his heart, a longing to bridge the chasm of silence that seemed to stretch endlessly between them. One evening, frustration clawed at him as they sat in the fading orange glow of sunset. The cattle were quiet, their soft breaths punctuating the stillness. He turned to her, his voice wavering like a candle flame. "What do you think about when you look out at the fields?" Eloan's gaze remained fixed on the horizon, the hues of dusk mirrored in her eyes. Her response came in the form of a soft sigh, a whisper of an emotion he could not decipher. It stung, igniting a tempest within him. Was she truly content, or was this silence suffocating her? Each day, he watched her move through life's minutiae, placing fresh hay in the stalls, kneading dough in the kitchen, her fingers working as if possessed by an invisible thread of purpose. There was beauty in her devotion, yet Silas felt a pang each time she flitted past him, carrying her burdens alone. A longing pulled at him, a desperate desire to shatter the silence that clung like a cold mist. "Elawen," he whispered one morning as she poured water into the trough. "Why did your brother sell you?" The words slipped from his lips like a pebble thrown into a still pond. The ripples of his question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Elawen turned to him, her expression a mixture of surprise and something more profound. Fear, anguish. She shook her head, her dark hair swinging like a curtain, refusing to answer. Silas's heart sank. The barrier he had longed to dismantle loomed larger than ever, every attempt to connect met with her deep-seated reluctance. In those moments, he felt an ache. Understanding seemed like a distant star, its light flickering further away. He clenched his jaw, wrestling with the gnawing need to know her truth, to coax her voice from the shadows where it lay buried. One night, after a long day of labor, the sky darkened, and rain began to patter against the roof like a lullaby. Silas found Elawen sitting by the window, gazing out as droplets raced down the glass. For the first time he stepped closer, drawn by the vulnerability etched across her features. "Are you afraid of me?" he asked, sincerity lacing his voice. She turned to him, her expression shifting, uncertainty mingling with the flicker of a spark. He leaned in, heart thundering as the silence stretched between them, a fragile thread stretched taut. And then her lips parted, a small sound emerged from her throat, a mere whisper as fragile as the wind. "Silas." The name tumbled forth, a delicate flower blooming in the desert of their silence. The world around him seemed to shatter and reform, and he caught the breath of hope mingling with the rain. Her voice stirred something deep within him, illuminating the corners of his heart he had long locked away. In that moment the barrier cracked, the potential for understanding glimmering in the soft light of her unguarded heart. Silas felt a rush of warmth flood his chest, invigorated by the knowledge that she could speak. As she met his gaze, he saw a flicker of something new, possibility. He reached out, an unspoken promise forming between them, a vow to explore the vast, uncharted territories of each other's hearts. The rain continued to fall, washing away doubt, erasing the lines of separation, inviting them to embark on a journey that would weave their silences into a shared story. Silas stood at the edge of the corral, the low sun casting long shadows across the dusty ground. The sound of the cattle mixed with the rustling leaves of the cottonwoods. It was a tranquil scene, yet within him stirred a tempest of thoughts. Elawen moved gracefully among the animals, her hands deft and gentle, a silent symphony in the chaos of their bleating. He watched her, captivated by her affinity with the creatures, but there were moments he caught the hint of something deeper in her eyes, a longing, a fragility that spoke volumes without uttering a word. As dusk fell, the dim light painted Elawen's face in soft pastels, illuminating the quiet beauty that Silas had come to admire. He had never been particularly adept at expressing emotions, much less reading them in others. Yet, there was an undeniable connection growing between them, an unspoken bond forged in shared silences. He approached her, the crunch of gravel underfoot breaking the evening stillness. She turned, her gaze locking onto his, and for a fleeting moment the world around them faded away. "Dinner's almost ready," he said, his voice betraying a nervous tremor. He gestured toward the ranch house, the familiar warmth of home beckoning them. Elawen nodded, a small smile gracing her lips, yet her eyes seemed clouded with something Silas couldn't grasp. A hesitation lingered in the air, almost palpable. As they walked side by side, he could feel the weight of her silence pressing against him, a barrier he desperately wanted to breach. The table was set, the homey aroma of roasted meats and freshly baked bread filling the air. As Silas served their meal, He caught Elowen's gaze drifting toward the window, her focus distant, lost in a thought that kept her tethered to a past he knew little about. He paused, his heart aching at the sight of her disengagement. "Is everything all right?" he ventured, unsure if the question would reach her in the labyrinth of her mind. She turned to him, her expression a mix of surprise and something else, vulnerability. It was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a serene mask. "I'm fine," she replied softly, her voice like a whisper carried by the wind. But in the depths of her eyes, Silas saw the flickering light of an unshed tear. It was a simple response, yet it echoed like a thunderclap in the silence that stretched between them. What was she hiding? What ghosts haunted her thoughts? The evening wore on, filled with gentle conversation, though Silas felt the tension still woven tightly around them. As he cleared the table, he caught Elowen's glance again, this time more deliberate, her brow furrowed. "Do you ever think about family?" she asked, her voice barely above a murmur. The question hung in the air, a heavy weight that Silas hadn't anticipated. He opened his mouth to respond, but faltered, unsure of how to navigate the emotional terrain. "My family. They were never easy to talk about," he finally admitted, the statement raw and unguarded. "There's a distance we seem to carry, like an unspoken agreement to stay apart." Silas felt the truth of his words peel away layers he had long thought protected him. He glanced at Elowen, searching for any sign of understanding, but all he could see was a flicker of recognition in her gaze that mirrored his own sorrow. Elowen hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her plate. "I had a brother," she confessed, her voice breaking fractionally. "But he sold me." The air grew thick with her admission, each word punctuated by the weight of her history. Silas's heart ached for her, the cruel fate of her past hitting like a crushing wave. In that moment, he understood her silence. It was not merely a lack of words, but a shield forged from the very wounds that had chained her spirit. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" he asked softly, the vulnerability in her revelation making his chest constrict. Desperation clawed at him to reach her, to let her know she was safe. But as her eyes fell away, he felt that all too familiar distance creeping back in. The unspoken truths hung heavy between them, a barrier as formidable as any fence dividing past from present. In that moment of misunderstanding, Silas realized how fragile their connection was, balancing on the edge of a precipice that could either bring them closer or tear them apart. In the flickering candlelight, the silence settled like an old friend with sharp edges. As Elowen's gaze became fixated on a distant point beyond him, Silas sensed the walls around her beginning to rise again. There was a vulnerability resting inside her, one that mirrored his own, yet now remained shrouded in uncertainty. The depths of her past and the specters of her brother's betrayal echoed in the space between them, and Silas clenched his fists, determined to bridge the chasm that threatened to swallow them both. The twilight sky draped its deep hues over the ranch as Silas stood by the wooden fence, watching the colors bleed into one another. Each evening felt like a ritual, a moment where the world outside his heart faded, leaving him in the solitude he had built for himself. Yet there was a shift in the air, something unshackled fluttered between him and Elowen, a whisper of possibility resting on the simmering ranch. Elowen spent her days tending to the animals, her movements fluid and graceful as she communicated with them in ways words could never capture. The way she checked on the horses, whispering sweet nothings into their ears, reminded Silas of the gentle caress of the wind through the grasses, soft yet powerful. He observed her, silent and still, feeling the warmth of an unfurling bond, alongside a cautious hope that stirred uneasily in his chest. One evening, Silas returned from the barn carrying a basket filled with apples. He spotted Elowen near the well, her silhouette framed against the glowing sunset. She knelt, her fingers gently trailing through the dust as shadows danced across her face. Suddenly she glanced up, her gaze locking onto his, and in that moment, the world around them faded. Silas felt exposed, the layers of solitude peeling away as Eloin's eyes sparkled with something he had long buried, a shared longing for connection. With a hesitant step forward, he offered her the basket, his voice barely more than a whisper. "For you." The words hung between them, tangible yet frail. A fleeting uncertainty flickered in Eloin's eyes as she contemplated the gesture, the distance between them pulsing with unspoken words. Slowly, a smile broke through the remnants of her doubt, illuminating her face and sending warmth flooding through Silas's veins. It was a smile that whispered understanding, that hinted at the uncharted territory of emotions blooming softly beneath their surfaces. She reached out, her fingers brushing the apples, and Silas felt an electric thrill pulse through him at the lightness of her touch. In that moment, there was a profound understanding, a silent exchange that connected two souls where words failed. Eloin picked an apple from the basket, holding it delicately as if it were a treasure. The simple act felt monumental, a fragile bridge being built between their worlds, one that drew Silas closer to the depths of her silence. As she took a bite, her eyes closed in momentary bliss, a soft gasp escaping her lips. Silas watched, transfixed, the sound echoing through the evening air, stirring something deep within him. The sweetness of the apple seemed to transcend their differences, uniting them in a shared experience. In that instant, Silas knew that the barriers he had built, the walls solidified by the echoes of his past, were beginning to crack, giving way to the budding intimacy blossoming between them. Eloin took another bite, then offered the apple to him, the gesture laden with a symbolism that felt profound. Silas hesitated, his heart pounding in his chest as he caught the warmth of her gaze. It was a small offering, yet it spoke volumes of trust. He accepted the apple, their fingers grazing together, and the warmth radiated through him, igniting a flicker of hope he had not realized he had been missing. Eloin's eyes sparkled with a silent challenge, one that invited him to step beyond his guarded heart. Beneath the open sky, as the stars began to emerge like distant dreams, Silas felt the weight of his solitude melting away. Eloin's presence was both a balm and a fire, illuminating the shadows he had long since accepted as his fate. He could see it then. Their connection was not merely a flicker but a blazing flame, needing only a breath to ignite fully. But the shadows of his past loomed large, challenging him to confront the fear that had kept him at bay. Eloin's laughter, light and melodic, cut through the air, wrapping around Silas, a gentle reminder of the beauty that existed beyond his walls. As she turned to return to her tasks, her demeanor shifted from uncertainty to determination. He understood then that this was just the beginning of something spiraling out of their control, something that demanded courage and vulnerability from them both. Silas took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her presence like a warm embrace, and for the first time in years, he dared to hope for what lay ahead. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue across the sprawling fields of Silent Ranch. Eloin stood at the edge of the pasture, her fingers tracing the rough edges of the wooden fence, longing fluttering within her like a trapped bird. She watched Silas as he moved methodically, tending to the horses, the muscles of his arms flexing under the fading light. The rhythmic sound of hooves against hard earth echoed in her mind, a calming pulse she wished to mimic with her own heartbeat. Silas, sturdy and unspeaking as always, had become a solid presence in her life. His quietude was a balm, wrapping around her like an embrace, yet the silence between them was thick, a heavy fog that filled the spaces where she longed to voice her thoughts, her feelings. Eloin felt like a marionette cut loose, suspended in stillness, her heart tugging at the strings she couldn't pull. Words danced on the tip of her tongue, but the shadows of past fears held them captive. As she ruminated over this internal struggle, memories flickered like a film reel in her mind. Eloin recalled her brother's harsh words, The way they had slashed through her spirit. "You're worthless without your voice," he had said. And those words echoed in her thoughts, drowning out the whispers of her true self. The quiet around her felt suffocating, and she clutched the fence as if it could anchor her wavering resolve. For the first time, she sensed a flicker of rebellion igniting in her chest. Iluan turned to Silas, who had paused to wipe the sweat from his brow, his eyes catching the last rays of sunlight. She studied him with a mixture of admiration and fear. He didn't just see her for her silence. He sought her presence. In those moments, she felt a surge of confidence, a flicker of hope sparking within the shadows of her mind. If only she could break free from the binds of her past. Perhaps, just this once, she could honor the person she was becoming rather than the one she had been forced to be. Summoning every ounce of courage, she stepped closer to him, her heart pounding a rhythm of uncertainty. "Silas." The name slipped out, barely above a whisper, but it felt as substantial as a boulder thrown into the still waters of her soul. The air thickened with 1,000 unsaid words, and she watched him turn, surprise flickering in his eyes, the tenderness etched in their depths, stirring something profound within her. Silas opened his mouth, as if to speak, but no words came. In that brief moment, the world fell away until there was only the two of them, suspended in the space between silence and connection. Iluan was acutely aware of her own breath, the way it mingled with his, creating a rhythm that beckoned her to forge ahead. She felt the weight of his gaze, anchoring her, and the fear of speaking again was countered by the yearning to bridge the chasm that silence had forged. But doubt, that insidious demon, reared its head. Memories of her brother's cruelty clawed at her, a cacophony of belittling words threatening to drown her will. The desire to speak clashed with the survival instincts honed from years of suppression. Could she truly speak without being punished, without being defined by her past? The internal battle raged on, a tempest of will and fear colliding in the confines of her heart. With a deep breath, Iluan felt the warmth of courage wash over her. She stepped closer, nearly losing herself in the depths of Silas's gaze. Her voice broke once more, the syllables clumsy but alive with intention. She pressed on, channeling every ounce of her being, hoping her voice would carry the weight of her truth with it. Silas. This time, it came out stronger, as resolute as her heart felt. It was a call, a plea, an invitation woven with vulnerability. Silas's expression softened as he leaned forward, a flicker of realization dawning upon him. He stepped into her space, the distance between them collapsing under the gravity of their connection. The sound of her voice, though hesitant, filled the silence with a promise. The darkness that had once held her captive began to retreat, a timid light breaking through. In that moment, Iluan no longer felt like a mute girl sold by her brother, but rather a woman reclaiming her voice. Finally, she had begun to speak her truth. Iluan stood in the shadow of the dilapidated barn, the setting sun casting elongated shadows across the dirt floor. Dust motes danced in the warm light, swirling around her like whispers of the past. She had spent countless hours here, her fingers tracing the rough grain of wood, lost in thoughts of a world rendered silent. Today, however, she felt a stirring within her, an ache that resonated deeper than her silence. Silas, the rancher who had given her another chance, was out in the fields, tending to the land with a quiet dedication that was both grounding and inspiring. As she watched him from a distance, the weight of her emotions felt like a tempest brewing inside her. Memories flashed through her mind, the day her brother had sold her, the journey to this new life, and the kindness Silas had shown her. He had come to her when darkness enveloped her spirit, lifting her from despair with simple gestures of humanity. With each passing day, the bond between them had grown, unspoken yet palpable, a tether that grounded them both against their fears. Silas paused, wiping the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and gazing toward the barn where Iluan stood. He could see the way the light danced around her, illuminating her solemn expression and giving life to the shadow she often carried. His heart swelled at the sight of her, the silent girl whose resilience spoke louder than words. Yet a sense of yearning surged through him. He longed to hear her voice, to know the sound of her thoughts, to shatter the barrier that had kept them apart. Slowly, Elowen made her way towards him, the earth crunching beneath her feet. Each step felt monumental, a journey not just across distance but through her innermost fears. She sensed Silas's gaze lingering on her, an unspoken invitation to come closer. As she reached him, a gust of wind swept through the field, rustling the leaves and sending a shiver down her spine. She could feel the weight of unexpressed emotions filling the air, hanging heavily like the fading twilight. Silas crouched down to meet her gaze, his eyes searching hers for understanding. There was an intensity in his expression, one that made her heart race, as if he too felt the gravity of the moment. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, an intimate gesture that sent warmth cascading through her. In that instant, Elowen's heart thudded loudly, echoing a desire that had been locked away for too long. "I need you to know something," Silas said softly, his voice a low murmur that seemed to ripple through the silence between them. "You are not alone anymore. Whatever darkness you carry, I will bear it with you." His words were a lifeline, binding them together in that fragile moment, yet Elowen remained caught in the tempest of her own emotions, words trembling at the edges of her being. Elowen's breath hitched as she steadied herself, the weight of his declaration intertwining with her own fears and hopes. She knew Silas was anchoring her to a reality that felt impossibly beautiful, but the notion of speaking his name, a name that had become a lifeline for her, felt monumental. She had practiced it in the depths of her mind, the syllables weaving through her consciousness like a melody unplayed. In a surge of desperation and determination, Elowen stepped closer, the air thick with anticipation. She could feel Silas's heartbeat, steady and reassuring, resonating within her. "Silas," she breathed, the name escaping her lips with an unsteady tremor, like the first raindrop in a long dry spell. There was a power in that simple utterance, a declaration that shattered the silence she had lived in for so long. Silas's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and overwhelming joy flooding his features. He stepped back as if the name itself had encapsulated the very essence of their bond, of the journey they had traveled together. "You spoke," he whispered in disbelief, his heart soaring as if he had witnessed the birth of a star. In that pivotal moment, amidst the swaying shadows of the barn, the two souls found their home in each other's gaze. The silence was broken, and their story, once filled with unspoken words, now flowed freely like the promise of dawn, breaking on a new day. In the golden hush of dawn, the sun spilled its light across the vast expanse of the ranch, casting long shadows that danced with the gentle breeze. Elowen stood near the weathered fence, her fingers tracing the rough wood, each groove a memory, a whisper of the past. Silas approached, his heart a quiet storm, the weight of unspoken words heavy between them. He knelt in the dew-kissed grass, surrendering to the earth, a simple gesture of vulnerability. Elowen watched, her breath hitching as she stepped closer, the space between them shrinking, filled with unuttered hopes. She raised her hand, fingertips brushing against his cheek, the warmth igniting a flicker in his chest. His eyes met hers, and in that shared silence, the world around them faded into a symphony of rustling leaves and distant birdsong. Elowen leaned in, her lips parting as if drawing air, and from her heart, a soft sound emerged. His name, cradled in tenderness. Silas closed his eyes, the syllables wrapping around him like a warm embrace, breaking the silence that had long defined them. Their gazes locked, and in that moment, the unspoken became a bridge, binding two souls in the soft glow of dawn.